It was the night of the super full moon, and I, along with a group of other monster hunters, had been put on call in a national park in order to rapidly respond to any creature incidents that might occur. The full moon tends to bring out the crazy in all creatures, including humans, and the super full moon tends to take that crazy and inject it with rocket fuel. Besides the obvious werewolves, just about everything tended to act up around the super full moon. In the days leading up to the supermoon, there had already been reports of strange happenings in the park and its neighboring towns. An old man that lived in a cabin cut off from the rest of town had reported an aggressive pack of wolves in his area that had been bothering his dogs. He was too old to deal with it properly and had called the ranger station to possibly get some help. The old man obviously wasn't aware that we were the help that was coming his way. During missions inside the parks, we would dress similar to park rangers in order to blend in. A good hunter is never seen or heard. We come in, do our job, and fade away, like a ghost. It's a thankless lifestyle, but I haven't met a hunter that got into this for the notoriety. There were 4 of us on the hunting team: myself, Wheeze, Polly, and Nate. The 4 of us were growing bored as the night approached. Bored isn't really the right word. We were all getting a bit antsy. I knew this group fairly well, and all of us were fiends for action. The sun was beginning to set, and the day was turning to dusk. Polly threw out the idea that we go to the old man's cabin about 10 miles away and give him a wellness check. See if he had seen any more wolves or had any more trouble with that wolf pack. We were almost positive the wolves he was dealing with were actually werewolves. There was a pack we knew of that was active in that area. The 4 of us all had magazines with silver-tipped bullets loaded up and ready to go. I hadn't dealt with a werewolf in a while and was looking forward to the possibility of tangling with one again. I respected werewolves and loved the challenge of hunting them. They had the mind of a man inside the body of an ultra-predator. It was a combination that presented both a challenge and a thrill when you prevailed. Some hunters go after easy prey, just collecting a paycheck, but I was, and still am, driven to be the best. Not for anyone out there. Like I said before, this is a thankless job done in the shadows. Being the best was a challenge I had created for myself. Challenging hunts and dangerous enemies made me into a better hunter, and hopefully I will leave this world on top. Before we could make the call on whether to go to check on the old man or not, the phone rang. It was the old man we had just been debating about. He was hearing wolves again howling near his cabin and was trying to give us a tip on where to find the wolf pack. He didn't know it, but the group of us viewed people like him and other campers and hikers as bait. The team of us were expecting something to happen that night, and after his problems leading up to the supermoon, we were already keeping an eye on him and his cabin, expecting it to be attacked. Honestly, he was an easy target for any creature that lurked in the park, but that was the trade-off for living in the middle of nowhere. We all jumped into the SUV and headed out towards the old man's cabin. It was about 10 miles into the woods away from the station we were posted at that night. The group of us didn't talk on the way up. All of our eyes were busy scanning the forest as we passed, looking for anything out of the ordinary. We were almost to the cabin when the car was hit by what felt like another car slamming into the rear side of the vehicle. The shock of the impact knocked us into a skid and the car fishtailed as Wheeze struggled his best to keep the car on the road. He almost succeeded, but the car failed to regain its traction, sending us head-on into a tree. I didn't pass out from the crash, but was definitely dazed. I looked around the mangled car through the cloud of dust from the airbags to check and see the status of the team. Wheeze was knocked out, but both Polly and Nate were okay as far as I could tell. The windows of the SUV were all smashed out, and the back and the front were both crumpled from the impacts. Polly was about to speak, but before he opened his mouth, I quickly shushed him by putting my fingers to my lips. I motioned, pointing outside the car, and began talking to him using American Sign Language. This needs a bit of explanation. I'm not deaf, and neither were any of the other team members. When monster hunting started to become more of a global affair, and as hunters started to travel outside of their own countries, communication quickly became a problem. It isn't easy to find translators, and it's especially hard to find and keep a translator that is willing to participate in a monster hunt. Communication needed to be quick and direct, and a global language needed to be developed for the hunting community. American Sign Language was the best answer we could all agree on, because it's pictorially based and English is already spoken by a majority of the world. It seemed like the best option. So all hunters and machinists, no matter their area of expertise, all learn and have the ability to communicate in sign language. Moments like this, like the one we found ourselves in, were perfect times to utilize signing. The wolves were most likely still very close to us, and their hearing is leaps and bounds better than ours, but those idiots didn't know sign language and couldn't hear what we didn't say out loud. I signed to Polly to keep quiet, that the wolves were somewhere near, that we had to wake up Wheeze and get away from the car. He agreed, and I started to try and get Wheeze back to consciousness. Suddenly a loud crash hit the roof of the car, and the metal began to dent and bend above us as a huge werewolf had jumped on top of the car. He wasn't doing anything but standing there as the three of us that were awake looked up, holding onto our rifles pointed at the roof of the car. The wolf just stood there. His low growling and breathing could be heard clearly. The forest around us had gone dead silent. Nate signed to me asking if I had silver bullets loaded up already. I nodded, put in my earplugs, and took aim at the roof of the car, in between where the dents had formed. I fired into the roof, and a whimper rang out. I kept firing until the werewolf jumped off the car and ran into the woods. It let out a howl of pain and filled the forest, bouncing off around the trees for miles. We all watched the patch of forest where it had disappeared into. Suddenly, its howl got a response. 4 or 5 more howls rang out from all around us. The new howls were miles away from the sounds of it, but I doubted it would stay that way for long. The gunshots startled Wheeze awake, and I forced him out of the car. The 4 of us abandoned the car and jumped onto the road, starting to run the last mile up towards the old man's cabin. I watched Wheeze aimlessly trying to make his way up the road and keep up with the group. It was most likely he had a bad concussion from the crash. He kept randomly stopping, kneeling down, and looking back behind us. I grabbed him and signed for him to get to the front of the line, but it wasn't registering with him. I looked into his eyes and could see he wasn't there. He wasn't going to remember any of this. Another howl let out, stopping all 4 of us in our tracks. It came from the side of the road just to the right of us. We all took up positions and aimed into the trees. The wolf rushed out from behind the woods. Lightning quick speed, he grabbed Wheeze and started attacking him right there in the road. It tore at him with its claws, growling and snarling as Wheeze tried his best to fight it off. "Fight!" I yelled at him as I started to unload my weapon, running towards the werewolf, filling it with every last silver bullet I had. The wolf collapsed to the ground. I had put so many bullets into him I expected it to jingle when he hit the ground. I grabbed Wheeze, but he was bleeding from everywhere and anywhere. His eyes were filled with shock, but they still weren't focusing. He still wasn't present. I looked back at Nate, and he signed to me that it was too late. We needed to keep going. We abandoned the werewolf body and Wheeze there for the cleanup crew and continued on running up the road to the cabin. The howls from the forest continued as we ran the last mile, and they continued to sound closer and closer. It was a matter of minutes before they were right on top of us. Not knowing how many of them there were, I was unsure of how we would fare if they attacked us. I saw the cabin come into view as the trees began to open up into a small clearing. We sprinted to the front door, banging on the side of the cabin to get the old man to open up. Another howl bellowed out as we stood there on the cabin porch. I could feel this howl in my body. The reverberations gave me goosebumps. They were just behind us, possibly even closer. The cabin door swung open and the dogs inside started barking as we forced our way inside. We would explain after we got the door closed and the situation settled. What's happening?" the old man questioned as we barricaded the door and checked the other entrances into the cabin. I looked at the old man and simply said, "Wolves." It seemed to be enough explanation for him, and he quieted down and let us do our thing. He turned his attention to calming down his dogs as they whined and barked in the confusion of everything. 4 howls rang out, filling the clearing. We couldn't see any of them, but we knew they were there. They were planning something. We needed to plan something as well. "Call in for air support. We need some eyes out there," I told Polly. He nodded and immediately tried to raise our station for extra support. I could hear him calling in for helicopters, but my eyes were glued to the forest outside. He came back over to me after finishing the call and told me 5 minutes. The group of us, now including the old man and his dogs, waited in silence. Nothing but the sound of the wind and the crackling fire could be heard. The forest was quiet now, but that didn't mean the werewolves had left. The silence was broken as we heard the helicopters coming closer to us. "It's them," Polly said. He pressed on his ear so he could hear what they were saying to him. "They've got 5 heat signatures inside the tree line." We all looked out the window to see if we could catch a glimpse of any of them. The helo hovered above us, shining its spotlight into the trees, highlighting the positions of the 5 heat signatures. They had us surrounded. "Get ready," Polly said, just as the helo started to unload its guns into the werewolves hiding in the trees. The cabin vibrated as the helicopter's guns fired. "They're scattering," Polly filled us in. The helo continued to fire until it was dry and turned back to head to the station. Relief filled the air of the cabin, and I took some deep breaths. I didn't realize it, but I must have been holding my breath that whole time. "That was close," I said to the old man. "You boys really don't like wolves, do you?" he replied. I was a bit shocked that he still assumed it was just a pack of hungry wolves that we had been dealing with. "How are your dogs?" Nate changed the subject. Everyone was fine, the dogs included. The rest of the night we were stuck in that cabin with the old man. It was too risky to run back out there and try to get back to the station. The other teams were around the park and busy with other calls and couldn't come help us either. It was best for us to just sit tight and wait for the morning. The old man was a gracious host. He made us some of the best stew I've ever had and some coffee to help us get through the night. I think he was happy to have us there with him that night. I sometimes forget that normal people haven't been hardened by the same things I have, and he was probably more scared to live out there than he would ever admit. I realized then that we had become something else through our dealings with monsters. We had shed aspects of ourselves that made us human, the fear and compassion that the old man still had. We had moved beyond all of that to do our job. We had become closer to monsters than we were to humans.